Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's this month's patron pick, and I've got to say, I was kind of intimidated when I saw the topic. I'm going to be talking about randomization techniques and some specific concerns related to shuffling. And the reason that I was a little bit intimidated is because this is one of those things where everybody seems to have an opinion about it, and a lot of that opinion seems to be based on superstition or halfway understood statistics classes that they might have took a few years ago. There's a lot of different things that I've heard people say that I can't seem to find any justification for in any of Magic's rules or policy documents. I'm certainly looking forward to a lot of comments about how I don't understand anything about how statistics work, and any tournament that I judge is almost certainly rife with cheaters taking advantage of my ignorance. But let's take a look at what the actual rules and policy documents have to say about this topic. Alright, so first of all, I want to answer the question that's pretty much on everybody's mind. What is shuffling? And so we're going to take right out of the CR, and to shuffle a library or a face-down pile of cards, what you would do is randomize the cards within it so that no player knows their order. And that is the actual definition that the comprehensive rules gives for shuffling. And what makes this kind of interesting is if you were to take a look at the Magic Tournament rules, you see something a little bit different. Randomization is defined as bringing the deck to a state where no player can have any information regarding the order or position of cards in any portion of that deck. And so that's kind of interesting. The difference is pretty startling if you take a look at what we saw in the comprehensive rules and what we see here. And then on top of that, if you look in the infraction procedure guide, you see something yet different. This is under the section related to insufficient shuffling. And the definition of that would be if a player unintentionally fails to shuffle their deck sufficiently, or a portion of the deck, before presenting it to their opponent, or fails to present it to their opponent. And a deck is not shuffled if a judge believes that a player could know the position or distribution of one or more cards in their deck. And so, as you can see, there's three different times in Magic's rules and policy documents where it defines what shuffling is, and it specifies a criteria for what sufficient shuffling would be. And all three of them look kind of different. And so, with that, I'm going to try to give my opinion on this question, which is a very important question for Magic tournaments, and also something that has sparked a lot of debate throughout the years. So how many shuffles do we need? And the first thing that I want to talk about related to that question would be disclaimer, right? So as I mentioned before, this is something that has been a question for a long time, and I certainly am not under any delusions that I'm going to be settling this question once and for all with one video that I made. But with that being the case, I've presented what it says about sufficient randomization and all the rules and policy documents. What I'm saying right now, and for the next few slides, is going to be my interpretation and opinions about that, but certainly there is not any implication that these are the opinions of some other judge or the wider program as a whole or Wizards of the Coast. This is just what I personally interpret those statements to mean, and what some of the practical implications of that might be. So that is hopefully enough for everybody to say that only Judge Dave doesn't know anything about statistics, but the rest of the judge program is probably good. If anybody wants to put any comments like that in the comments, definitely, this is my opinion. And if you don't see a CR citation or something similar on a slide, then you can assume that that's my own personal interpretation of what something means, and not something that I'm claiming any sort of authority on. All right, so with that, the first question that we would like to answer is, what do we mean by random? Right? Okay, what do we mean by random? And this is actually kind of a not as trivial of a question as what you might think at first glance. If you're somebody who's really interested in mathematics, I would recommend looking into Bertrand's paradox, which is a really interesting statistical conundrum where you can see the implications of the word random not being really rigorously defined. And it definitely does lead to some kind of counterintuitive results where there's different types of distributions. But if you don't like math, that's fine. I'm going to try and go through this with as few equations and Greek letters as possible. So what do we mean by random? And to see what the issue is in a Magic the Gathering kind of context, I've put together a few different things that maybe you could potentially interpret the word random to mean. Maybe nobody knows the order. Or maybe nobody knows the position of any individual card. So if I asked you what number would you say down from the top the first lightning bolt is, then you would not be able to do any better than just guessing by trying to answer that question. Or maybe nobody knows how the cards are distributed in the deck, or maybe each individual ordering of the cards in the deck is exactly as likely as each other individual ordering of those same cards. And so if you look through here, then this one here seems kind of similar to what you saw in the definition given by the comprehensive rules. And this test here, the second one, seems a little bit more similar to the one that we saw in the Magic Tournament rules. And this one here, the third one, seems more like what we saw in the IPG. And this fourth one here is what you would probably hear a lot of players and certainly a lot of judges claim is what we actually mean by random. So the fact that these are all different is kind of unsettling. Because, right out of the gate, it really puts a hurt on our potential for getting a really satisfactory answer for this question, right? And so maybe we'll talk a little bit about what the difference is between these. So no one knows the order, right? That would be satisfied even with something as simple as a cut, right? So like if I asked you to write down on a list, you're allowed to look at the deck list, and I'm gonna ask you to write down on a list what the first card is, and then what the second card is, and then what the third card is, and so on. And then we're gonna look at the actual order of the deck, and for each one that you get right, we'll give you a point. And just randomly guessing, you're expected to get some number of points. So maybe the test would be that if you were to do this, then the person after several attempts would be getting no more than what you would expect someone who just randomly guessed on each number would be. So no one knows the order. But hey, if I showed you the order of the cards and then I cut the deck once, as long as you didn't see exactly where it was in the deck that I cut, even knowing exactly what every single card was in the beginning, you would not know what card was the first, what card was the second, what card was the third. No one knows the position of any individual card. Maybe that would be a different test. You could maybe imagine something like if I said, okay, there's one blood moon in this deck, and your job is to write down a number 1 through 60 for where in the deck you think the blood moon is. And again, you would be passing this second test if every time you did that, you would be doing no better than if you just randomly generated a number from 1 to 60 and said that was your answer. And you can see that actually is something that just cutting the deck would not satisfy, right? Because if you were to at least see approximately where the cut happened, then you would be able to approximately know, okay, maybe if I started out with the blood moon exactly on top and then I cut the deck with about this many cards, then I would say that it would be about this many cards down. So really you would just be able to estimate about how many cards down the blood moon. So you definitely would have an advantage if you did a cut as the shuffling and you saw them do that cut and you knew that was the change in the distribution. So right out of the gate, you can see that there is a very significant difference between the two. And I think that I think that most people would agree that if you just cut your deck in front of your opponent, so in other words, took some of the cards from the top and put them on the bottom and didn't do anything else that changed the order other than taking the first few cards off of the top and putting them on the bottom, I think that most people would agree that that doesn't actually count as shuffling. So I don't think there's really anybody out there who's arguing that this no one knows the order should be what we actually interpret random to mean, which is kind of weird because that's what it says in the comprehensive rules, that what random means. But even from a practical viewpoint, it seems like it would be very easy for somebody to take advantage of something like that. So maybe what we would actually want would be something like this, where no one knows the position of any individual card. And the problem with that is we've got like this third one that's even yet stronger. So nobody knows the distribution of the cards in the deck. And I say that this one is kind of similar to what we saw in the Magic Tournament rules, the test that I described for the second bullet point. For this third bullet point, we would probably need a different test. So no one knows how the cards are distributed in the deck. So like if I started out with all of the with all four of some card that I have four of, all on top of the deck, and then we had the shuffling process happen, it should not be possible for me to say even the first one's here, the second one's there, the third one's there. So if we took this test that we did in the beginning where we said, okay, what's the first card, what's the second card, what's the third card, what's the fourth card, and we kind of modified that a little bit so that now we're not asking all at once, but we're rather asking what's the first card, and then flipping over the first card and seeing if that's what it was. And then maybe after that we ask what's the second card, and then we flip over the second card, and then we ask what the second card was, and we see if that's right. So after each individual guess, we would be able to see what the previous one was. And maybe we wouldn't have to like predict the actual card. Maybe we would just say something like land or non-land, and then again you would be able to. So this I think would probably be closest to what I would personally say that we should be understanding the term random to mean, would be passing that test, where not only do we not know the position of any individual card, but we also don't have any information about approximately where in the deck that individual card is. Because that's something that would help us to get an advantage on that third test, right? If we knew that the Blood Moon was approximately halfway down the deck, then we would start saying halfway down the deck, we'd start saying Blood Moon until we actually saw the Blood Moon come up, and then we would have an advantage for this one. And then each permutation is equally likely. So for some people, they might try to argue that this this third and fourth bullet point are actually equivalent. And I would argue that they're not. I would argue that there actually is a practical difference in between these two. And so the practical difference, I think, would be each permutation is equally likely, and nobody knows how the cards are distributed. So it is possible for the cards to be distributed unevenly, but nobody to know that. Or indeed for nobody to be able to say how they are distributed unevenly. And it is possible that a shuffling procedure might be biased in some way towards, maybe the cards that are on the bottom are like 10% more likely to stay on the bottom, or at least in the bottom half of the deck. But if that is the case, I would think that it would be extremely impressive if a actual person who was not watching the shuffling happen on a slow-mo TV replay would be able to A, pick up on that, and B, use that in any meaningful way in an actual game of Magic. So that's the practical difference between no one knows how the cards are distributed and each permutation is equally likely. If we had a shuffling procedure where the top cards were more likely to stay in the top half of the deck, and the cards that started on the bottom, four positions were more likely to stay in the bottom half of the deck, I do not believe that it would be possible for a normal person to take advantage of that information, or to pick up on that information rather. So in that case, we could see that there is an actual gap in between each permutation is equally likely and someone is able to find out that each permutation is not equally likely. So because of that sort of a difference, I think that these actually would not be equivalent in a practical sense, even if they might technically be, if you were to consider a theoretical perfect world. So that is some really interesting information, but it still kind of leaves the elephant in the room of, okay, so it doesn't seem like we're super close to the actual answer here. So, but keep in mind that the takeaway from this is my personal opinion is that this here is the one that we really should be looking at, and the reason behind that is because if you look at the rules and policy documents, this one is actually specifically mentioned in one of the rules and policy documents. And, it's the strongest one out of the ones that are mentioned in the rules and policy documents. So I feel like it's a reasonable idea to go with the strongest one that actually does have some rules or policy support. If somebody would like to argue that each permutation is actually likely, is what's intended by the rules and policy documents language, well, I guess you could make that argument, but for some other practical reasons, I would say that that's not a super, that doesn't have a lot of historical backing for how that's been interpreted. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about exactly what I mean a little bit later on in the presentation. So you've probably heard, a lot of people have probably heard that 7 is the number of times that we're gonna shuffle the library to make it random. And so a lot of the time, there actually has been academic research into this topic, and if this is like kind of the takeaway that a lot of people who have heard of such academic research. There's actually been a few papers that I was able to find that made claims like this. But again, this is maybe so, but as an engineer, for somebody who's working in the real world, it's important to understand the assumptions behind the model that came up with this answer to see if that's actually the answer that we want to use, or if maybe there's some limitations that might be relevant that might make this number a little bit too big or too small for what we're actually doing. So when these academic papers were considering how many shuffles you would need to randomize a deck, they were almost invariably dealing with a 52 card deck. And that's because, there's probably the most amount of academic interest in 52 card playing card decks, not Magic the Gathering decks. So, of course, it is possible for a Magic deck that you are shuffling to have 52 cards in it. For example, if you draw an opening 7 cards and then you crack a fetch land, and then you take a land out of your library and put it onto the battlefield, then your library will have 52 cards in it. Assuming that you started with 60. However, if you are playing Urian and your starting library was 80 cards, then you would have more. And if you were playing EDH, it would be even more. And if you were halfway through the game and you had already drawn like 20 cards out of your library throughout the course of the game, then it would be less. So intuitively, it should make a lot of sense that the number of cards that you're shuffling would influence the amount of riffle shuffles that you would need in order to get an answer, to get a random library. I will say the 7 is related specifically to riffle shuffles, and that would be the type of shuffle that I think is probably the most common in the game of Magic, where you split the deck into 2 approximately equal sections, and then you mash them together so that the cards are interleaved. And they come into one deck where it's not the order within each half stays the same, but they're going back and forth. And we'll have a couple of practical demonstrations to see exactly. But like I said, this is probably the most common way to shuffle. So I think we can probably assume that that's a reasonable thing for us so far. But yeah, if you were to consider that it was a 52 card deck, then maybe it would be 7. But if your deck was bigger or smaller, then you would expect the number to be bigger or smaller too. So for example, if you had 3 cards that you were shuffling, then 7 shuffles would actually be more than the possible number of ways that you could arrange those 3 cards. So clearly that would make sense that for a number smaller like that, you would expect to see less shuffles. And, it also makes sense that a bigger deck would require more. But this isn't something that you hear a lot of people talking about, is like, maybe the 7 number should be adjusted up or down in consideration of the deck size. And also, all the cards are unique in a 52 card deck of playing cards, right? So like the Ace of Spades and the Ace of Diamonds are 2 different cards, right? So if we had an ordering where the Ace of Spades and the Ace of Diamonds changed places, then that would be considered a separate ordering from the original one. On the other hand, if my Magic deck had the Lightning Bolt from Beta and the Lightning Bolt from Unlimited switching places, you probably would not consider that to be a different ordering. And so, of course, with Magic the Gathering decks, there's most often the case, except for singleton formats, where you're going to have the space of permutations significantly reduced by the fact that you're playing a lot of cards that are the same identity as other cards in your deck. And again, the 7 cards, or the 7 riffle shuffles, is what we need. That number is assuming that all the permutations need to be equally likely. That is the criteria for randomness that they were using in order to come up with this number. So again, the criteria for randomness that I think would be more appropriate, that I argued would be more appropriate in the previous slide, was actually a slightly weaker criterion than this one. And so as a result of that, I think that this 7 number, we can't just like blindly accept this and without thinking a little bit about these types of considerations. So okay, now we're up to my favorite part, which is where I'm gonna give you the actual answer. So how many times should I shuffle? So actually, before I talk about this, there is actually one more. Oh man. And so there's actually one more kind of practical consideration that I'd like to call everybody's attention to for why I think the 7 number isn't really what we want to use, at least all the time. And so in order to see exactly what I mean, what I actually did is I got out one of my decks, and I'm going to go ahead and riffle shuffle it 7 times. So you can see the video here. I'll just let the clip play. What I'd like to point out is the real point of that is that, well, I would be prepared to bet that most of you did not watch that clip all the way through. Because of the magic of YouTube, you were able to skip ahead, so you hopefully were able to come back to the action part at the end. But in a real game of Magic, you cannot do that. So it took me, and I considered that to be like a comfortable and reasonable pace for riffle shuffling. In order to complete 7 riffle shuffles, it took me over 45 seconds of physically shuffling the cards. And that's not even counting the amount of time that it would take my opponent to also shuffle after I was done. And so you can start to see like a little bit of the issue here with doing this in a practical gameplay type of a setting, right? Like if you considered trying to shuffle that much every time a shuffle event happened in a game of Magic, I went ahead and watched a couple of coverage summaries from some historical Magic tournaments that happened relatively recently, and I found that it was probably about every 2 or 3 turns that a player took that someone had to shuffle their library in the modern format anyway. And so you can really see that if you were going to be doing that much shuffling every time, I think that it would probably not be considered reasonable from the players that they would be expected to do that much shuffling. I think that if you got bored watching me shuffle 7 times just once, what are the chances that we could expect Magic players to not similarly get bored having to watch their opponents do all that shuffling in an actual game of Magic? So that's one other reason why I kind of feel like the just riffle shuffle 7 times is a little bit kind of a oversimplification. And again, if we wanted to claim that the criterion we should be using is we need all the permutations to be equally likely, well, it gosh darn sure is not the criterion that we're using right now. Because then we probably would need to be doing like 6 to 7 riffle shuffles every time that you were instructed to shuffle your library, and that is most certainly not what actual people do. I'll spoil a little bit of something for you. Also, it's also not what judges look for. I posted this question in a Facebook group with a lot of my colleagues, and I got several answers. None of them specifically said a number that they were looking for. They all said stuff like, well, making sure that it looks good and making sure that they had good shuffling practice. None of them, despite the fact that I specifically asked people to say how many shuffles would be the minimum you would need to see in order to not issue insufficient shuffling, none of them had a specific number that they looked for. And I think that should tell you a little bit about what the importance is of having a specific number that you try to do in your game. So how many times should I shuffle? And here's the real part. I hate being a cop-out, but this is one of those times where the cop-out answer is it depends. There is not a specific number that the judge program says that you should be doing. There is not a rule or a policy that specifically says a number that you should be doing. It just says that it should be random, and it doesn't even consistently say what it means by random, so we have to kind of make a determination on what we mean by that too. So any answer that I could give you would almost certainly be an answer that some judge out there is going to disagree with, and probably like a reasonably competent, well-versed in the rules and policy judge, because again, the rules and policy is not cleanly written in this case. So I'm not going to leave everybody out to dry on this question. I will give a little bit of advice. For me personally, what I think is that if you shuffle at the very beginning of your match, and probably also at the beginning of your games, you should be doing like a pretty thorough shuffling. So I would be on board with the 7 to 8 riffle shuffles at the very beginning of a game or match. Reason being is because you've probably, or at least as far as your opponent knows, have gone through your entire deck and could know the order or have arranged the order however you want. So that's a nice way for everybody to be on the same page, that know they aren't trying to pull something like that. If you're in the middle of a game and you're cracking a fetch land, I would for sure go less. I hesitate to throw an exact number out there because there's a lot of different situations, and especially if you're talking about a EDH game where your deck size is about twice what the average deck size in a modern tournament would be. There is going to be a lot of variance. So, but I will say that after just a few, and I'm not going to put an exact number on that, but after a few riffle shuffles, I was able to see some pretty reasonable looking passing the 3 tests that we talked about, even if we weren't strictly passing the all 4 or all of the permutations are equally likely test. So that's what I would say. I would say like do an actual like thorough 7 to 8 and maybe a few more if you're playing like extra cards in your deck at the beginning of a game or match. And I would say less than that, probably a few less than that if you were shuffling in the middle of a game. But the real answer to this question is actually also coming straight out of the MTR, which is that once the deck is randomized, it's presented to the opponent. By this action, the player states that their deck is legal and randomized, and the opponent may then shuffle it additionally. And at competitive and professional rules enforcement levels, the players are required to shuffle their opponent's decks after their owners have shuffled them. And so this is the actual answer to how many times should I shuffle, which is that shuffle until it feels right. And if your opponent isn't satisfied with that, they have the right or the obligation to shuffle your deck some more, and that way everybody can be happy. So this is the real answer to that question. Shuffle a reasonable amount of times, and if your opponent doesn't agree that it's super duper ultra random, then that's why they get to also shuffle after you have shuffled it a few times. So there you go. That is the official answer that Judge Dave says for how many times should I shuffle. Now this is a new topic, another very important topic that I suppose is something that a lot of people tend to ask when the topic of shuffling comes up. What about pile shuffling? Right? So if you're not aware, pile shuffling is the act of dealing your deck face down into different piles and then either, combining the piles together in some way. Some people like mash all the piles together all at once. Some people will stack the piles on top of each other after the fact. So that is what the term pile shuffling refers to. And there is, fortunately, a clear and unambiguous answer from the rules and policy documents with regards to this practice. This is kind of a controversial practice. It's something that used to be a little bit more widespread. I feel like nowadays I don't see as many people doing it as I did when I started judging, and even less than when I first started playing. So from the IPG, it says that any manipulation, weaving, or stacking prior to randomization is acceptable as long as the deck is thoroughly shuffled afterwards. So the IPG is specifically saying that it's okay, and the MTR is specifically saying that it may not be performed other than once each at the beginning of a game to count the cards in the deck. So some of my colleagues are actually super duper like down on the pile shuffling. They actually I know some people who refuse to call it pile shuffling because it's not actually shuffling. You're not actually randomizing the order. It's a deterministic process, so it's actually pile counting. And if you're one of the judges who I was just, if you could not tell by the way that I was articulating those words, I am not of the opinion that the pile shuffling should not be called pile shuffling, but instead pile counting. I think that that's kind of a ridiculous claim to make. Even if the name is not technically relevant, that's the name that everybody always has called it, and so that's what it is. If you want people to understand what you're talking about, you need to use the name that people use for it, and that's what the name is. That being said, there is some merit to the point that those people make, which is that it is not a actual shuffling in some of the definitions. As we saw before, the term randomize is not super well defined itself, so it is certainly the case that pile shuffling, even if you we're looking at that weakest of randomization definitions, the one where no player could know the order. If you pile shuffle carefully and you do it the same every time, which most people don't, by the way. But if you were to do it the same every time, which it is possible to do, then yes, you are in fact taking a known ordering of cards and you're changing it to another ordering, which you could also know. And so that's the reason why we have this rule here that says that you have to thoroughly shuffle the library afterwards. And so that's the reason why pile shuffling is kind of looked down upon by some judges is, well, it's just wasting time. And, okay, so that's another one of those things that I think kind of makes more sense if you examine it in the historical context that it's part of. So there was a time in Magic's history when we were a lot stricter about presenting your deck than we are now. So, like, for example, if you were to accidentally drop a card on the floor and present 59 cards as a result of that, or if you were to wish for a card out of your sideboard and then forget to take that card out of your deck, so you're actually playing with 61 cards instead of 60. Both of those are things that in the past were potentially or by default actual game losses. Right? So counting the number of cards in your deck before you presented was actually a lot more important than it is now. Both of those, were taken pretty seriously. If you had more or less than 60 cards, given that you started with 60 and you're supposed to have 60, if you had more or less than that number, by even one card, that was taken as like a really big deal that corrupted the entire game, and as a result, we can't say how the game would have gone if you would have done it right. So you get a game loss, and that's how it used to be. So as a result, it was a good practice to take it pretty seriously to make sure that you were presenting the correct number of cards. So I think that kind of cultural backdrop, if you were to put pile shuffling into that sort of a context, it might make a little bit of sense why people were saying, yeah, it's a good idea to make sure, like, before you present your deck that you actually count it. And as a result, I personally can't see a good reason why you should tell people not to do something like that. Would it be faster to just thumb through the deck and count like that? Maybe. But it also probably wouldn't be as accurate. So the real issue is you're not supposed to use stuff like that to break up clumps in an attempt to prevent yourself from getting mana screwed or mana flooded. That is in fact that sort of manipulation, and mana weaving, by the way, is another kind of concept that goes hand in hand with that. I've never actually personally seen someone mana weave in a Magic tournament. I've seen it a few times at like conventions and stuff where you get like people who have that used to be a thing like way back in the day, but I don't know any players who really practice that nowadays. But like that's the real like issue with pile shuffling, and supposedly there was a way that you could pile shuffle 2 times and like basically get your deck like pretty much perfect land non-land distribution if you started it from all lands at the top and all non-lands at the bottom. So supposedly that was a cheat that people used to do, or at least try to do. Again, now that pile shuffling is less common, you're less likely to see something like that. And I think that was one of the other reasons why we put this once per game limitation in play, is to keep people from doing like that. Yes, it does take time, but so does shuffling. I'm not really convinced that the amount of time that it takes is like super long, especially if you're gonna confine it to once per game. I think that should be all right. So next question that I wanted to talk about: what if I see a card while I or my opponent is shuffling? And so this is again another rule that actually has some pretty direct rules and policy support. for what you're supposed to do. So anytime cards in a deck could be seen, including during shuffling, then it's not considered to be shuffled anymore, even if you only know 1 or 2 cards. So this again comes from the IPG section on insufficient shuffling. And so players are expected to take care in shuffling to not reveal cards to themselves, their teammates, or their opponents. So that's the deal. If you if you only know the position of 1 or 2 cards, hey, that still doesn't meet some of the criteria that we talked about where a player doesn't know the position of cards in their deck. So so that would mean that if you are shuffling your deck and then you see a card accidentally, then that would mean that you have not got a shuffled deck anymore. Same thing if you like see your opponent while your opponent is shuffling. Sometimes the bottom card of their deck, sometimes that it can be seen during that process. So if you see the bottom card of their deck, or any of the other ones, then should you call a judge? Well, maybe not call a judge, but you certainly should tell your opponent. And the reason is because no player is supposed to know the order, and no player is supposed to know the positions. So anytime they could have been seen, doesn't matter, doesn't say by whom, then it's no longer shuffled. So if you see cards in your deck, or see cards in your opponent's deck while they're shuffling it, and then they present to you, then you have not, your opponent has committed an infraction. They probably don't know that they've committed an infraction, but they have. They've presented a deck that is not sufficiently shuffled based on this definition here. And if you see your opponent commit an infraction and you don't call attention to that infraction in order to gain an advantage, which you certainly could be gaining an advantage from knowing like what the bottom card or few cards in their deck would be, then that's cheating. So the answer to that question is, if you see your opponent's cards while they're shuffling, then you need to tell them to shuffle some more, because that's exactly the same situation as if your opponent sees some of their cards while they're shuffling. So either one of those would be considered a case where the player has not presented a deck that is sufficiently shuffled. So you might be wondering, though, well, what about this section from the MTR? So throughout a match, players are responsible for keeping their cards above the level of the playing surface and for making reasonable efforts to prevent hidden information from being revealed. However, players may choose to reveal their hands or any other hidden information available to them, unless specifically prohibited by the rules. So this is a case. Players may not actively attempt to gain information hidden from them, but are not required to inform opponents who are actually accidentally revealing hidden information. So here's the thing. This sentence here, the last one that I read, that they're not required to inform opponents, that sort of makes it seem like you wouldn't have to call it out if you saw your opponent's bottom card while they were shuffling. But that is kind of contradicted by this sentence that comes before it. So unless specifically prohibited by the rules, which it is, because as you can see here, it is specifically says in the rules that no player is allowed to know the order. So, and it's also hidden information that's available to them, which they are able to share, which they are not able to know the position of the cards in their own deck, of course. So this is not information that's available to them, and it is something that's specifically prohibited by the rules. Therefore, this bottom sentence does not mean that you don't have to inform your opponent who accidentally reveals cards while they're shuffling. You do. And if you don't, then that could be considered cheating. So the other case that you might see come up is, what if I see a card from my opponent's deck while shuffling my opponent's deck? Because that is a thing, right? Like you certainly can, shuffle your opponent's deck, and it certainly is possible to accidentally drop a card from the opponent's deck on the table face up, or accidentally catch a glimpse of it while you're doing the shuffling. Maybe you're mashing them together and they catch, so you look down and it's oops. So that is that is a case of looking at extra cards, which is a different infraction. I made a whole video talking about exactly how that works. I'll link that, and you'd be able to see how that situation would shake out. So that is all the stuff that I had prepared for today. want to go over a few things to close out with some, like, of my opinion, best practices when you're shuffling. If you go back to that clip from me shuffling, you can look for those. The two really important things that I think of is shuffling in such a way that you change the top and bottom card of your library. So if you do a normal mass shuffle or riffle shuffle, then a lot of the time what will happen is, if you cut the deck in two and then you don't change the order, so if you are doing a normal riffle shuffle, what you do is you cut the deck in two and then you mash them together like this. But look at this. If you take a look at this, it's possible for the bottom card to stay being on the bottom and the top card to be stay being on the top. So this angle, I think, shows that. So if we started like this and we go like that, then the card that's on the top is still going to be on the top after we do this. And the card that was on the bottom is still going to be on the bottom. So that means that what you would want to do is you want to take it like this and then put the cards, mash them together a little bit offset like this. So that way the card that's on the bottom of the section you took from the top is going to end up on the bottom, and the card that's the top of the section you took from the bottom is going to end up on the top. So, of course, it would not be permissible to do a bunch of riffle shuffles and never change the top or never change the bottom card of your library, right? And, of course, it also would not be permissible for you to intentionally try to manipulate the top card going away or the bottom card staying in the same spot. Neither of those are things that you should be trying to do for obvious reasons. And that is something that people intentionally or occasionally do. Sometimes it's intentional. A lot of the time it's an accident and people don't realize that that's what's going on. But that's an important thing to look for and educate people on if you see that happening. The other like really big one, I think, with shuffling, and this actually came up a few things a couple slides ago. So it says here that a player should shuffle their deck using multiple methods. I have absolutely no idea what they're referring to when they say that. I suppose it could be like, sometimes you see people shuffling and they shuffle like this, where they like just cut some of the cards out and they put them on top, and they do this a bunch of times. I don't think I've this line here does not seem like a line that is really enforced. I've never seen or heard of somebody trying to enforce this line. So if the only thing you ever do is mash shuffle or riffle shuffle, then I would say that's, you should be fine as far as I'm aware. I do not know what other types of methods that this might be trying to refer to, but I will say that I and all of the other colleagues that I'm familiar with are 100% fine with it if you just use one type of method, as long as that method is riffle shuffling. If you do patterned pile shuffling, then you certainly would need to use another method, as explained later on in the in this rule. So that is that's two of the points, and the last point that I wanted to make is when you're shuffling, the best practice is to try and do it in a way where you're not looking at the deck at all. That way, there can't be any attempt at funny business, and this sort of issue, which could potentially be like a super awkward one, isn't going to be an issue. I know that it's going to take a little bit of practice to be able to reliably and reasonably quickly do a normal shuffle without looking at the deck. It certainly took me a while anyway, but it's not that bad. The sleeves nowadays are such that it's a lot easier than what it used to be, that's for sure. And certainly if you're running with no sleeves, then that makes this challenge a lot more challenging. But again, if you can get to a point where you're certainly not seeing any of the cards, then that would be the best practice. So that's another thing that you should look for in your own games. So those are my like general purpose advice about how to shuffle and what the best practices for shuffling is. that is all the information that I think should really be important to talk about for this topic. I want to give a big thank you to all of my patrons, everybody who supports me on Patreon, and everybody who supports my channel through other means. I'm super grateful to all of you, and I hope everybody has an awesome day. Remember, if you're going to call me out in the comments for being dumb, please be respectful, and please list your reasons for why you disagree with whatever part that it is you disagree with. But that is all I have for you today. Thank you for attending this presentation. Join me again next time for another Daily Room, but until then, I hope you have a great day.